Good evening. Can you all hear me? I think I'm mic'd up. Great. Welcome. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West. Thanks for coming out to our talk tonight on U.S. military intervention and the American presidency. Topic that's sort of always of interest, but given the results of the last few days, even we couldn't have planned a more timely topic, I think. So I know you'll enjoy it. We're delighted to have our colleague here. I'm going to introduce a special guest first. In the front row here, we have former Congressman Jim Bilbray. So, in addition to our students, Jeremy, you really need to be on your A game tonight. We think you're up for it. Right. Jeremy Shapiro is here from Brookings tonight. Since this is Jeremy's first visit with us, I'm going to speak a little bit more about him than some of our more frequent visitors. Jeremy is a fellow with the Project on International Order and Strategy and the Center on the United States and Europe in Brookings' Foreign Policy program. He had been at Brookings earlier in his career and then spent some time at the State Department, where he was a member of the policy planning staff. He advised the Secretary of State on U.S. policy in North Africa and the Levant. He was senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, providing strategic guidance on U.S. and European policy issues. He also has been a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, an adjunct professor of security studies at Georgetown University. He's been at the Rand Institute. He's uniquely qualified to speak on this topic, I am fearless to say, and I know you'll enjoy hearing from him tonight, so I'm going to step aside so we can get started. Jeremy?
Thanks, Bill. I had no idea I had done all of that, so even I was sort of impressed. I want to talk a little bit tonight about how the U.S. Undertakes military interventions abroad, and how I think that this has changed in the Obama administration and what the implications are for that. The sort of insights for this are a mixture of the State Department experience that Bill alluded to. I was, for my sins, in this one of the sort of small cogs in the machine that was trying to understand the civil wars in Libya and Syria and trying to determine what the United States should do. And so a lot of the insights emerged from that, but a lot of the insights also emerged from the long study I've done of this topic. So I like to think that it's a sort of combination of that practical application and, a lot of reading. So I hope that it will be enlightening for you, and I'll look forward to your questions. And frankly, we're a reasonably small group here, so if you have questions in the middle, I'll probably finish the sentence, but just raise your hand and I'll be happy to talk about it. If you have complaints, if you want to throw anything at me, that's fine. I think audience interaction is important. And I think, the topic is one that tends to get a lot of attention. U.S. military intervention has for a very long time been the most visible and the most dramatic manifestation of American leadership in global affairs. We've had 128 military interventions abroad since 1890, when we sort of started this, and about 31 since the end of the Cold War in 1989. As Mark Twain supposedly said, a lot of people tell me he didn't say it, but whatever, wars are how God invented war so Americans could learn geography. And by that standard, we have really set out to educate the country a lot on geography. All of you probably learned fairly recently where Yemen is. So what that history means is that U.S. military supremacy, and maybe more importantly, our willingness to use it, remains one of the most important pillars of U.S. power. And contrary, I think, to the impression that's often been given over the course of the Obama administration, President Obama has really not shied away from using military force. He has had a full-scale intervention in a civil war in Libya, sustained air attacks in Iraq and Syria. He's used drones and special forces in Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, Uganda, and elsewhere with rather unprecedented vigor. The bombing campaign against Syria that began last summer was the 8th country that he had bombed under his presidency. But as with other aspects of US leadership, this is changing in response to a new global environment. The Italian author Lampedusa was famous for saying, when he was talking about how he wanted to preserve the aristocracy in 19th century Italy, that in order for things to stay the same, some things are going to have to change. And that's essentially the approach that Obama has taken to military intervention. In order to preserve American military supremacy, in order to preserve this tool, some things are going to have to change. And you can see the source of his discomfort with the way that this tool has been used in the past. He expressed it, I think, most clearly in a speech at West Point in May of last year. Since World War II, some of our most costly mistakes came not from our restraint, but from our willingness to rush into military adventures without thinking through the consequences, without building international support and legitimacy, without leveling with the American people about the sacrifices required. Tough talk often draws headlines, but war rarely conforms to slogans. So this leads me to a couple of hypotheses that I'll try to defend tonight. First, there is a new US approach to intervention under Obama. Interventions still happen, but they differ from the way that previous presidents have done it. And I think this can be demonstrated by looking at the Obama administration interventions, particularly in Libya and in Iraq, but also the sort of non-interventions in Syria and Ukraine when the president decided not to intervene. And the second hypothesis is that is a little bit more speculative, which is that this approach that Obama has developed over the course of his presidency will persist into future presidencies of either party. And what this means is that Obama's approach is not just a result of a sort of momentary conjuncture of domestic politics and geopolitical circumstances. It's not something which just reflects his thinking. It responds to some persistent global trends which will outlast his presidency. First, the emergence of new powers and greater multipolarity, which means a relative, and I emphasize relative, decline in the US capacity to influence the world. Some of the emerging US political and budget constraints on military intervention that we saw very clearly in the course of the Iraq War. And on the opportunity side, new opportunities for changing the way that military intervention can happen through new technologies, especially through the use of drones, other standoff weapons, and special forces. So I'll now describe the approach that I think Obama has created, or the Obama administration has created. It has 4 aspects, which I call the 4 Ds. Domestic politics, diplomacy, doctrine, and legal. I can't think of a D word for legal, so there's a prize if anybody comes up with that. So first, domestic politics. There is a sense of very limited domestic political support for new large-scale military interventions. And part of this is, as Obama himself has often said, fatigue from a decade of war. But I would note that this was also conventional wisdom pre-9/11. In fact, George W. Bush essentially ran on the same concept that we didn't want to do this kind of thing. And it's pretty much a constant throughout American history, or at least post-war American history. The Obama administration, though, in particular, has placed a premium on low costs, few casualties, and minimal commitment that can reasonably predictably deliver results. So drone campaigns obviously satisfy these conditions, but even a larger operation like the Libya war in 2011 is a case in point. That war, which lasted, I guess it was about 6 months, cost the United States approximately $1.2 billion. That's 0.1% of the cost of Iraq. It resulted in no U.S. combat deaths, and it never contemplated a military presence on the ground. As Obama said in announcing that he was embarking on this conflict to the country in March of 2011, in this particular country, Libya, at this particular moment, we are faced with the prospect of violence on a horrific scale. We had a unique ability to stop that violence, an international mandate for action, a broad coalition prepared to join us, the support of Arab countries, and a plea for help from the Libyan people themselves. We also had the ability to stop Gaddafi forces in their tracks without putting American troops on the ground. You can think of each of these as a requirement for military intervention. And it's a heavy set of requirements if you think about it. We have to be able to do it. We have to have international support, people willing to join us. We have to have support of key countries in the region. We have to have a request for help from the country itself. And again, because he emphasizes it twice, we have to have the ability to do it. In Syria, in the Syrian civil war, where these conditions couldn't be guaranteed or couldn't even be predicted, there has been no military intervention in the civil war, despite the greater humanitarian and geopolitical stakes that everyone understood were at stake in Syria after 2011. This is a high standard, I think, in American politics. In Syria, the Syria question over the course of 2012 and 2013 tested whether it was sustainable domestically. Excuse me. There was quite a lot of frenzy about this in Washington. I'm not sure if it reached out here in 2012, 2013, really right up until the ISIS invasion of Iraq in 2014. And we felt it very strongly in Washington, this pressure from the foreign policy elite, from the media, that something had to be done in Syria, that the United States needed to do something in Syria. John McCain was the sort of standard bearer of this idea. And it really resonated with sort of Washington veterans back to the debates about the Balkans in the 1990s, where President Clinton was said to have remarked that it was politically difficult not to intervene when something like that is happening, because you have to demonstrate control to the American people. But interestingly, it doesn't seem to have penetrated that much into the mass politics. It was something which was very present on the pages of the Washington Post, in the New York Times, in foreign policy debates around Washington, in the statements of the senators, but it really didn't come up at all in the election. The latest poll right before the 2012 election said that 73% of the American public was against it. And Mitt Romney, if you look at the sort of foreign policy debate in the 2012 election, basically didn't make this point. He never really raised the point that the president wasn't doing very much in Syria because he didn't think it would be useful to him electorally. It was very interesting, I think, from inside the administration to understand the relationship between the decision to intervene or not intervene in Syria and the 2012 domestic election. And because I think it really gets at the complex relationship between domestic politics and military intervention. I think it's not, as people assume, that the public is really always against it and that it's hard to intervene. Actually, it's relatively easy for a president to whip up support for something like this. And a lot of the discussion in the press corps was leading up to the 2012 election that the president was waiting for the election to be over because he didn't want to go against the polls and do something in Syria. But when the election was over, he would start to intervene in Syria. Actually, from the inside, kind of the opposite was the case. The president's political advisors understood that they could intervene in the summer of 2012. They could intervene in Syria, and it wouldn't hurt them domestically. Actually, it would help them domestically in the short term, and the election was in the short term. For 3 to 4 months, they would get what's known in the political science literature as a rally around the flag effect, which means that their popularity would go up as everybody got excited about the war. And even though people had opposed the war at first, they would come in the first few months to support American arms. And this is a very clear pattern in almost every American military intervention. Support goes up for the first 3 to 6 months, and it stays there. It stays there until something goes wrong, essentially. But what the administration was worried about in 2012 in terms of Syria was not the election. It was not November. It was January. They were worried that they would intervene in Syria for electoral purposes and then be stuck with it for their second term. And the rally around the flag effect would fade. They had no plan to get out, and it would dominate their agenda for the second term, and they wouldn't get any of the domestic stuff that they wanted to get done. One could argue they're not anyway, but bear with me here. And this is, of course, the story of the second term of Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s with Vietnam, and the second term of George W. Bush with Iraq in the 2000s. And I think that does sort of demonstrate to you what the president is thinking about when he's doing these things. It doesn't really matter what the public thinks right now, because he can create public opinion for the war. That's relatively easy. What he can't do is sustain it over the course of more than about 6 months without moving toward quick victory. And if he can't get to victory in 6 months, or at least show substantial progress in 6 months, then the public will turn against him and he'll be stuck with it. And this is the very typical pattern for military interventions, and it's specifically what Obama is trying to avoid. So the second aspect of this approach is diplomatic. And in the Obama administration, the United States has been seeking, in my view, to find a new balance between leadership and burden sharing. What I mean by burden sharing is that getting assistance from other countries to participate in these military operations, not having to bear the lion's share of the burden for the military operations. This is not remotely a new issue. If you've been following this stuff through the years, we've been having burden sharing debates with our allies, I don't know, since the beginning of time, I would imagine. Certainly at least since World War II. And every president says that he wants to get more out of the allies. But they rarely succeed. And I would argue that in the Libya operation in 2012, for the first time ever, the United States succeeded in launching an operation without contributing the lion's share of the burden. How did they do this? I think that they were successful in this regard because the U.S. was willing to allow others to assume leadership of the operation. In this case, the British and the French under the umbrella of NATO. They were willing to use U.S. leverage on potential spoilers to keep them out of the way. And most importantly, they were willing to credibly threaten to allow the operation to fail if others did not take on responsibilities. They did a similar thing in a much smaller operation, which you guys probably didn't pay much attention to, in Mali and Africa the next year. And it worked in a similar way. The French took the lead in that operation as well. And they've done, I would argue something similar in a non-intervention. Is there a dog here or something?
Yeah.
No. I don't usually get a lot of canine audience. That's good. I'm trying to branch out.
He's working.
Yeah. That's the non-operation in Ukraine, or at least the diplomatic lead in Ukraine, has also, I think, in a similar way been farmed out to Germany. So again, in Syria, at least before last summer, where no coalition of countries was willing or able to take up a similar offer, there simply was no intervention against the Assad regime. We had a lot of discussions with various countries. So you guys, want to intervene in Syria? No, after you. No, after you. And it went around in circles like that, and nobody did it. And I think that this new diplomatic style has had rather dramatic implications for NATO and for the transatlantic alliance particularly, which faces a tension between its traditional mission of territorial defense and a potentially more salient mission of intervention. And it's unclear if the Libya model can be replicated diplomatically and what are its limitations. I think the problem is that if an intervention really needs to be done, i.e. it can't fail for very clear reasons of national security, then this won't work because everyone will understand that the United States can't let it fail, and they will simply say after you, and the United States will have no choice but to accept. So the real question there is, do any of these operations really need to be done, or can we convince others, more importantly, that we don't believe that they need to be done? We've had a lot of difficulty with that. And we saw that this process of coalition formation didn't really work in the anti-ISIS campaign because it became very clear to all of our allies that it was more important to us than to them. And so we ended up leading it. They ended up doing what they usually do, which is issuing a strong statement of support, sending, in some cases, a token force, but basically giving us the privilege of doing it. The third D is doctrinally, and this is what I mean by this is how the United States chooses to fight. The United States is moving away, I think, very strongly from the counterinsurgency military doctrine that dominated the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and is seeking a new doctrine that minimizes the use of manpower, that reduces the risk to U.S. personnel, and that removes U.S. forces from a sustained interaction with domestic populations. The U.S. is no longer contemplating putting tens of thousands of troops on the ground for several years at a time, but it is still looking to accomplish similar U.S. objectives through the use of drones, standoff weapons, and special operations training and raids, and in extremis, large or small-scale bombing campaigns like we've seen in Libya and recently in Iraq and Syria. And this new doctrine has already had effects on the forces. Right there, we've seen reduced manpower and funding for large ground forces, and increased attention to unmanned aerial vehicles and special operations forces. There are two issues, I think, that emerge here, which have been very present in recent operations. First is the sort of slippery slope problem. You can plan not to get involved, you can plan not to send large ground forces, but can you really accomplish the objectives without them? And if you get a little bit involved, if you start bombing and you become, in the military intervention terms, a little bit pregnant, and it's not working, can you not fall down that slippery slope? This really was posed very strongly in the Libya operation. It's hard to remember now. It only took 6 months. It seemed, at least in its narrow objectives, to be fairly successful. But about 3 or 4 months in, so in July of 2011, I can tell you within the government, we thought it wasn't working. We were really sweating it. And we were thinking about, will we need to send ground troops? And the president was like, no, stop thinking about that. But it's unclear how long that would have lasted. Things turned around actually quite suddenly, and they were kind of a surprise to us. And so the question was never completely posed, but we were already worrying about it 4 or 5 months into that operation. The second issue is what's called the stabilization problem. Stabilization means operations to create stability more than just remove an enemy. It's sort of the sort of post-conflict phase of an intervention. It's one thing to defeat the enemy. It's another thing to rebuild the institutions, to create a democratic or at least a functional state in the place that you just conquered. And of course, stabilization tends to be a manpower, ground forces intensive activity, because you got to be there to stabilize. So it would appear that the lack of manpower and ground forces is a significant impediment to stabilization. And it's unclear whether there are effective alternatives to this. Colin Powell in the 1990s formulated what he called the Pottery barn rule, essentially, which is you break it, you bought it. It turns out Pottery barn doesn't have that rule. I did a little research. So you can feel free to break things in Pottery barn, but don't feel free to break things in the Middle East. Because if you break them there, you kind of bought them. And what this means, what Obama has, I think, tried to do is overturn the Pottery barn rule. He hasn't actually tried to solve the stabilization problem. Again, going back to his speech on Libya in 2011, March of 2011, he said, the transition to a legitimate government that is responsive to the Libyan people will be a difficult task. He had noticed that it wasn't going very well in Iraq and Afghanistan. And while the United States will do our part to help, it will be a task for the international community and, more importantly, a task for the Libyan people themselves. Translation, don't call me. And you saw after the Libyan operation that the day that Gaddafi was killed, which was in October of 2011, the United States shut down that operation and more or less went home. I mean, we opened up an embassy and we sent a bunch of technical assistance and financial assistance. Well, not really any financial assistance, but technical assistance. But the US military went home. But of course, it hasn't worked. Libya's instability grew and is flowing over into the neighborhood, and it seems to be affecting U.S. interests. The jury is still out on this, I suppose. As a domestic political question, it clearly did work. The war took 6 months, and it was off the front pages, and it was considered a big success. It was a surprise to no one that a year later, or 2 years later, the country blew up into instability. But the United States hasn't been sucked back in yet, so it depends on how you measure it, whether you think it worked. Obama has said that it's the biggest regret of his presidency in terms of foreign policy that he didn't take greater measures to stabilize Libya. I'm not really sure I believe him, because it's not clear what he would have done differently. The problem is that there are similar problems in every alternative. We have tried various models in the last 15 years. In Afghanistan, we had a NATO-led stabilization model where the United States led a formal coalition of many countries, 60 countries at its height, under the umbrella of NATO. In Iraq, we had an American-led model where the United States essentially tried to do this itself with a sort of ad hoc coalition of a few countries. And in Libya, we tried to have a UN locally led model for stabilization. These three models only have one thing in common. None of them worked. The advantage of the last one is not that it works any better, but that at least you're not involved. And so that problem, I think, remains a huge one. It's just not clear how it impacts US domestic politics yet. So my fourth D, in sort of a brutal violation of the alphabet, is the legal question. Here I mean international law. It's interesting to note that the new US approach in using drones and special forces relies on a very internationally controversial concept of sovereignty and what in UN terms is called the responsibility to protect. Although the West has viewed Libya in part as a success, many of the emerging powers have sort of buyer's remorse. They feel manipulated by the UN resolutions that led to Libya, which essentially said that there was going to be a humanitarian protection mission, but it turned out to be a mission to overthrow the government. And they are committed to opposing giving the United States the same type of authority again. And you see this very, very clearly in Russia and China's opposition to providing any sort of similar authority in Syria after the Libya operation. And it's not just Russia and China. It's also non-traditional democratic allies like Brazil and India and Indonesia, these sort of rising, and Turkey, I should add, rising emerging powers that are often democratic, but nonetheless don't see the world in the same way that we do and don't appreciate the idea that American power can simply be decided by the United States, and American military power can simply decide to enforce whatever rules it wants in various parts of the world. So, two issues arise as a result of this. First, it's unclear whether the West and these new emerging powers can come to an understanding of the conditions under which intervention would be justified. And without it, it's very hard to form the coalitions that Obama says are necessary. And second, and this relates to what I was just saying, it's going to be very difficult to find a firm moral and legal basis for limiting the responsibility of the intervener. A lot of countries, Brazil is a particularly interesting example of this, noticed in Libya that the low-cost intervention served very little if it leads to a high-cost stabilization or if the stabilization isn't done at all. And so the United States needs to articulate a view about how it's actually going to use its military interventions, not just to solve a crisis, but to actually set these countries on a path to greater stability if it wants to get the legal basis from other countries to continue to do such things. And so far, we haven't been able to do that. So, in sum, so I'm summing up, don't worry. This new approach has demonstrated substantial utility in Libya, in the drone campaigns, but I think that the jury is still out on it in many respects, particularly in terms of stabilization. And I think a question remains whether whether the new approach can allow the United States to lead and to adequately promote global stability at a moral and a fiscal price that the U.S. population is willing and able to bear. And this brings us to the sort of second question that I began with, will this type of doctrine persist? It has obviously these flaws that I pointed out. And so the question is really, is it about President Obama, is it about his administration, or is it about larger geopolitical trends? I have to say, from the inside, it often did seem as if the president had imposed this doctrine on the bureaucracy. In Libya, the idea that the U.S. would not lead was anathema, and it took constant vigilance on the part of the White House to make sure that the State Department and the Defense Department didn't just seize control of the operation. That is their culture. They've been leading for 70 years. That's how they define themselves. They don't like letting other allies lead, and they don't trust in their competence, which is extraordinary if you look at the American record, but nonetheless. The allies don't really believe it either. David Cameron and Nicolas Sarkozy, the Prime Minister of Great Britain and the President of France, signed up to this idea that the U.S. would lead this operation for the first 10 days and then it would be turned over to them. And when the President came to them on the 10th day and said, "It's yours," they said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, we agreed 10 days ago that you would take this over after 10 days. And they said, "Well, yeah, but we didn't really think you were going to do that." He meant it, and he gave it to them, even though they claimed they weren't ready. And he provided some assistance to make sure that they could be as ready as possible. But it was a difficult and dangerous thing. And I have to say, from within the U.S. bureaucracy, everybody thought this was a stupid idea. But by and large, it eventually succeeded. In Syria, it was very well documented in the press that the president refused deeper involvement, despite the fact that many of his key aides, including my boss, Secretary Clinton, the Secretary of Defense at the time, Leon Panetta, David Petraeus, who was at the time the head of the CIA, and General Dempsey, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all supported deeper involvement. It seems on a certain level to be a very un-American doctrine, even at the bias toward control and escalation, the idea that the United States will lead, the idea that we can control events abroad, that our military is capable of nearly anything is a palpable feeling in Washington, and I think even outside of Washington. And you see this constantly, we see this right now on questions of Ukraine, where there are calls for the United States to sort of take over from the Europeans, to send arms, whether the Europeans want us to or not. And we saw it just a week or so ago in the Iraqi operation to retake the city of Tikrit, which the United States had essentially left to the Iraqi army, supported by Iranian militias or Iranian-backed militias. And this is incredibly controversial because the idea that we would let others carry our water in that way is not something that corresponds to U.S. strategic culture. It's not the way we've typically done things in the last 70 years. And of course, in the case of the Iranians, there's always this assumption that they're getting something out of it. From my point of view, I always thought, if you get two people that really hate you to start killing each other, that's kind of a strategic success. But actually, it's not really generally seen that way. And if you read the press coverage, it was, where is the United States in this fight? Why aren't we in control? Why aren't we in leadership? And this gets to an interesting question about capacity, what the U.S. is really capable of doing. I like to say, with a sort of slight paraphrase of a very famous general, that amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk capacity. It is very, very difficult in U.S. discourse to admit that the United States can't do something abroad. You can say that we shouldn't. You can say that they don't want to. You can say that the public isn't interested. But you can't say that our vaunted military, that our very effective diplomatic corps is simply incapable of something. Presidents don't talk that way, or they very rarely do, I should say. It's very normal for the Prime Minister of Great Britain to get up and say, gee, there's a terrible situation in this country in the Middle East that you've never heard of. We really deplore it, but we can't do anything about it, so we're not going to. American presidents never say that, or very, very rarely say that. They always give an explanation which is not about capacity. They always say, we've chosen not to do this because it's complicated, because the American people don't support it, because we don't need to, because our interests aren't involved, whatever. Obama was, I think, for a brief time, willing to do this in the period in the first year of his second term, in 2013, essentially. If you look at some of his speeches in 2013, particularly the speech that he gave to the UN General Assembly in September of 2013, he said, "We can rarely achieve our objectives through unilateral American action, particularly through military action. The United States has a hard-earned humility when it comes to our ability to determine events inside other countries." And at a later speech in West Point a few months later, he said, "A strategy that involves invading every country that harbors terrorist networks is naive and unsustainable." Unsustainable. Humility. Rarely being able to achieve our objectives. This is not the type of language that presidents have typically used. I would say, in my study of the thing, it's very unpresidential language. And I think that the experience shows us why it's very unpresidential language. It was a disaster. His favorability rating in foreign policy plunged throughout this period. That, of course, had something to do with events, particularly with the sort of emerging crisis in Syria, but I think it was in a sort of harking back to the Jimmy Carter malaise speech in the 1970s, it was a mistake, a fundamental mistake, to tell the American people that you can't do something. And he stopped making it in June of 2014 when ISIS invaded Iraq. And if you look at the speech that he gave in September of 2014, which announced that we were going to get involved in the anti-ISIS campaign, it was a very different kind of language. And he said, we will degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL through a comprehensive and sustained counterterrorism strategy. Just the thing he said we couldn't really do a few months before. So you see that this is a difficult doctrine to sustain domestically. I mean, I think you can really talk about very serious domestic political constraints. And if you look at the way that the 2016 campaign is shaping up, basically every candidate, Republican and Democrat, with the sole exception of Rand Paul, is running on a more interventionist platform than the current president. They are all going to be saying, president should do more, we should use military power more, we should have intervened more in Syria, we should have intervened more in Ukraine. And this will have an impact. But in my view, I think we're going to see, no matter who is elected, that although they might try to launch these military operations, they are going to run up against this hard constraint of capacity that the president at least tried to allude to. And they may have to find another way of explaining it to the American people. But I think that they will move back, roughly speaking, to where Obama is, perhaps after making a few mistakes, hopefully not. Because I think it does reflect the fact that there are limits to our capacities, and if we don't operate within them, we will suffer. So that's it. With that, I'm happy to take your questions. I'm sorry I went on a bit long. Sure, go ahead.
Yes, actually, I'm dying to very good. I'm dying to ask two questions, but I guess I'll have to come back to the second one. So let me start with the first. I don't think you mentioned Congress at all. I didn't notice that word come up. And you know, in the Syria case, actually Britain went to the Parliament and they voted it down, and it almost seemed like they had a better democracy. But just a quick question about the War Powers Act. I think there was an attempt. And there's been some recent debate about why don't we actually do it. And the War Powers Act is on the books, and of course that immediately got turned over by Reagan and subsequent presidents, but that requires only emergency actions for 30 days, and then a review, a debate, and an approval through Congress. Why did it go that way, and why haven't we been able? I mean, Britain can do more review through their parliament than seemingly we can.
Yeah.
You know.
It's a good question.
It's very frustrating to me, I guess, too. But go ahead.
It's frustrating to me too, but I think that this is often portrayed as a sort of question of out of control executive power. This idea that that the president is just making these decisions, and the Congress is powerless to deal with them, and he's sort of overriding the intent of the Constitution by ignoring, or as the Obama administration did in the case of Libya, sort of interpreting out of existence the War Powers Act. Actually, and this is, I guess, gets at the reason that I didn't really talk very much about Congress. Congress is not very important in these decisions. I'm sorry. And you know, that is by their choice, broadly speaking. Actually, Congress has a lot of power to do this if it wanted to. The power of the purse is absolutely fundamental. You can't really run a war without it. And you know, and even if, and you know, regardless of what the law or the Constitution says, if the Congress were to stand up and say, we don't want to do this stuff, the president is very unlikely to do it because he doesn't want to go to war without that backing or with that opposition. That's never happened. The president sometimes asks the Congress, he sometimes doesn't, but he's always gotten consent when he's asked. Syria was almost a test case, but we never quite got there. In fact, it's generally been fairly easy for the president to get this consent. And I think that the reason is that Congress never wants to take responsibility for these issues. They never want to say either yes or no. What's interesting about the Syria debate is that it was sort of seen as, oh, the president is going to go to the Congress and ask permission. That was not what was happening. The president was going to the Congress and demanding that they take partial responsibility for the decision. And they were scared shitless that they might have to. And that's really, Congress is very rarely a restriction on the president. They, like the public, they will come back to haunt him if it doesn't go well, regardless of whether they approved it. That's the privilege of being a congressman.
You know, I'm going to point out something. I'm
Please.
chairman right now. Most people know the United States Postal Board of Governors. In 1970, Congress got so much heat for raising 1 cent on the postage stamps that they changed the law to give somebody else the power to do it, so they don't have to raise the price of stamps. Me. So, but
That's precisely in line with what I'm talking
well,
about.
but
yeah.
in January of 1994, I was in Damascus. I mentioned to you.
Yeah.
Met with the foreign minister, and I met with the chief rabbi of Damascus. Now, most of you don't know there's still 3,000 Jews, that's what he told me, still living in Damascus. And 25% of the population is Christian. And both the Christian leaders and the chief rabbi were scared to death that Assad's regime would fall at some point. Because they knew, and they said, the alternative might be much worse than what they've got. Our foreign policy, have we even looked at the possibility that the fact is, I know we want Assad to leave, but we've got a bigger mess by overthrowing Assad. I'm not sure we have a bigger mess having thrown over Gaddafi, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a fundamental question that the Obama administration has wrestled with more than previous administrations. There was this sort of assumption in previous administrations that if you could sort of summon the political will, you could go overthrow the horrible government and you could replace it with something better. But now people think, gee, maybe we can't replace it with something better. We can definitely overthrow it, which is, nice. But it's not remotely the end of the story. And in the Syria case, it was very, very obvious to us early on that Assad, you can't say enough bad things about him. At this point in his tenure, he is a mass murderer. He is responsible for untold war crimes against his own population. Just horrible things that are truly unspeakable and which I think that no United States government could ever truly associate itself with. It does sort of put him beyond the pale just from a purely moral standard. But that doesn't mean that the country is better off without him, intriguingly. There is a lot of chaos lurking behind him. The situation could always be worse. And nobody in the US government, when I was there, and I imagine still, really ever came up with a credible plan for even being able to have a better than 50% confidence that things would be better if he was gone. And when you look at the enemies that he has, a lot of them are barely better than he is, and that's not just from the standpoint of U.S. interests. It's also from the standpoint of the sort of pure humanitarian calculus that I just did. So it is a very difficult question. We've got some other people, so let's get some questions here.
Yeah. Correct me if I'm oversimplifying it, but kind of building on your point, isn't that essentially the same thing as what happened in Iraq with Saddam and the Ba'ath Party and the Sunni dominated over the Shia majority? I mean, isn't that essentially the
I think that
same
it
thing,
is.
essentially?
Other people would have different narratives, but I essentially agree with you. certainly it's the case that stability did not result from our intervention there, and the humanitarian situation undoubtedly became worse. There are people who will tell you that that was because we failed to make a few key decisions, and if we'd done things somewhat differently, and if we had, crossed that T and dotted that I and not disbanded the Iraqi army and not done de-Baathification, then we could have gotten to a better place. My personal view is that those mistakes, which maybe were mistakes, were on a certain level inevitable, not those particular mistakes, but we didn't really know what we were doing. We didn't really understand the society, and we never would. It's kind of impossible for the US government to understand a society like that. Individuals can do it, but US government can't. And so if we hadn't made those mistakes, we probably would have made other ones. And so this kind of concept that we can impose stability, as the president said, is really beyond our capability. And we need to, I think what the president is trying to do is to integrate that awareness, that lack of capacity into our intervention doctrine. But he's having a lot of trouble. Yeah, no. Did you raise your hand?
Yes. So I have a couple of questions. First, regarding stability, the question of stability is important because it is necessary to determine that it's necessary to determine what will happen after, we come in and bomb whatever country, of the month or year that we're choosing to bomb, that something better would be in its place. Seeing as how these previous countries in which we've intervened have failed to result in anything better after the intervention. For example, with Iraq, with Afghanistan, is it really necessary for the United States to fight these people? To have these countries and movements be our enemies, or are those countries better off without our intervention, seeing as how the alternative after they're done is no better than these people that are considered our enemies? The second question that I have regards American policy today with regards to, particularly with regards to Ukraine. You mentioned that, and I would agree with this, Obama's policies are different than previous presidents. But with regards to the drone thing and other instances of American policy changes, and with regards to military intervention, they're in the interest of safety, supposedly in the interest of making us, making it safer, less U.S. casualties, things like that. If we're going to get the enmity of a nuclear power like Russia, would it really be in the best interest of our safety, or would it be counterproductive with all these things that we're doing regarding drones and such that are supposed to be in the interest of keeping Americans safer?
Right. I feel like I've sort of over-convinced you. Maybe you came in with that, so maybe I'll argue just slightly against myself. I do that sometimes. I think that what people are concerned about when they're contemplating these interventions is not simply that the country involved be better off, but that the U.S. has a specific role and has played this role for many years as a sort of global stabilizer. And that if the U.S. ceases to play that role in important places, the instability will spread. I'm not sure I believe this argument, but I think it's important to understand it. And what that means is that it's not just about the country that you're intervening in. It's about a system of U.S. global leadership that provides stability and deters aggression around the world. And so in this argument, it's not simply that you are, it may well be true that the invasion of Iraq was badly done and created more instability in Iraq than was there before, but in demonstrating to the world that a dictator like Saddam Hussein could not thumb his nose at the United States, couldn't develop nuclear weapons, and couldn't invade his neighbors, and couldn't promote terrorism around the world, that has encouraged others to behave. And similarly, in Ukraine, the theory is that if you allow this aggression to stand, more aggressions will follow. This is the historical reasoning that comes from the experience with Hitler and with World War II, in which accommodating this aggression, not ignoring it, saying, well, Czechoslovakia really isn't important to us, we don't need to worry about it. You just encourage more aggression, and ultimately it ends up at your doorstep. Now, I don't precisely accept either of these arguments, but I do think that they are serious arguments. In any case, they motivate the American debate, and I think we need to take them seriously and not simply say, well, it didn't make the country better off, so it was a bad idea. Yeah, up here in the corner.
You said in the beginning, excuse me, of your talk, that you believed future presidents would kind of follow the Obama's method of intervention. With George W. Bush, every one of his advisors were wrong. From Dick Cheney, we're going to be seen as liberators. From Rumsfeld, from the oil was going to... Now Jeb Bush is going to be running for president, and he's taking the same advisors that his brother had. So
Yeah,
what would make a change?
His brother's experience. In fact, his brother did change. And in fact, the second term George W. Bush administration is actually fairly close to this policy. Not quite there, but definitely pushing in that direction. You should read, there's a great book by Peter Baker, who's a correspondent for the New York Times, called Days of Fire, which is about the Bush-Cheney relationship. And what he describes is the evolution of President Bush away from Dick Cheney in the course of his presidency, to the point where by the time he turned the presidency over to Obama, he kind of already had the policy that I've just described. He hadn't been able to articulate it. He hadn't even really been able to demonstrate it. But he full out refused to contemplate military intervention in Iran in the 2007-2008 period when Dick Cheney was for it. When the Russians launched the Georgia War in August 2008, this book, I think it's this book or it might be a different book, documents that there was a meeting in the White House and the question was raised of military intervention, and the president said, who's in support of it? Dick Cheney raised his hand, because he always does, and nobody else in the room did. Not a single other person even contemplated it. And the president just went, we're not. No, it was never really seriously considered. And I think that there was quite a bit of learning in the Bush White House and among most of the advisors. It's certainly true that there are people from that administration who are who don't see the evolution as going this way. John Bolton is a good example. I'm sure Dick Cheney is a good example. But I don't think that Jeb Bush is one of them for sure. And I don't think that the majority of the people who came out of that administration, especially the people who lasted into the second term, actually feel that way. This is, I would admit, a struggle within the Republican Party. It's also, frankly, a struggle in somewhat different terms within the Democratic Party. And I wouldn't predict that a president couldn't make more interventionist decisions in his first couple of years. What I'm predicting is that he will if he does, he will regret them, and he will follow the same path that George W. Bush followed. Yeah, here in the third.
In terms of stabilization in the Middle East from terrorist groups, do you think that we're focusing only on military intervention, we're sort of ignoring the social aspects? Shouldn't we be putting more effort into de-radicalization? Because we keep having different groups pop up, and that's going to keep happening even if we conquer the ones that are currently there.
Well, I half agree with you. I mean, I think clearly the military interventions don't stop the de-radicalization. Arguably, don't stop the radicalization, don't stop the creation of these terrorist groups. ISIS was born in the U.S. invasion of Iraq, largely created in the prisons of the U.S. occupation authority there. And that's, the sort of unintended consequences you always have. I don't think, however, that and I guess it's a separate topic, so we don't need to really go into it, that the de-radicalization programs that you're talking about are really much of an alternative. We've also not had any success doing it without military intervention. We can do, I think, some de-radicalization here at home, and that makes a lot of sense. But it's hard, frankly, and the idea that we really understand what motivates young men in Somalia or Syria to take up arms against their government and what creates radicalization in that context, I think is a bit of a reach for the US government. And so I'm not very confident about that. I don't think that terrorism generally has the type of socioeconomic roots that we like to say it does. It's not really about poverty. It's fundamentally a political, in the first instance political, and in the second instance psychological. It's about the psychology of young males who are alienated and have a tendency toward violence. That's my view. That is a very controversial view. So I'm not very confident that those de-radicalization programs are an alternative. I think we may have to accept, and this gets to my capacity argument, that this is a big problem. This radical groups arising in countries like this is a big problem. It affects us. But we don't actually have a solution to it. We can manage it. We are managing it. We have a homeland security system which works. We haven't had a serious terrorist attack in this country in nearly 15 years. And if you look at the predictions after 9/11, that was not supposed to happen. We've been very successful in that regard, in the homeland security. I personally am flagged for secondary screening. I don't know why. I don't think I'm dangerous, but I think it gives you some sense, if they're worried about me, that they're pretty vigilant and that this process works. So maybe we don't have to do this. It'd be great if we could, but it doesn't seem like we can. I guess we should come back to you. You want your second question?
Well, yeah, and I know there may be other questions, but just quickly. Actually, I was just writing that down too. That it may sort of, we could call it the Elder Bush model, or the UN model. What about a model that says basically we are, I think is what the UN intended, we are going to try to secure borders and help find ways to prevent Saddam Hussein, prevent somebody from crossing a border to try to take over, but that we can't really nation build. It's up to the people in that country that we can focus our efforts. This would help in Turkey, Syria. Anyway, can we focus?
This is a sort of containment doctrine, which I am partial to, but again, I'll argue a little bit against myself that the sort of senior George Bush applied this model in Iraq, and the way he saw it is Iraq invaded Kuwait, and that needed to be undone. That was a violation of a border, and we needed to do something about it. But that was it. That it didn't. Nothing else really needed. Once that was undone, once Iraq was sufficiently punished, you didn't need to overthrow the country, overthrow the regime. You didn't need to. You didn't need to create a democracy or whatever. They didn't even create a democracy in Kuwait, much less in Iraq. But what was interesting is that didn't work very well in U.S. domestic politics. And this is the sort of slippery slope problem, that having created that victory and having so demonized Saddam Hussein in order to rally the country to war, people quite naturally asked, gee, we've got this incredibly powerful military, there's this incredibly evil guy, we're already at war with him, why are you just going home? And in fact, a lot of people said that.
Schwarzkopf that same question.
Yeah,
He said, I didn't know what to do then.
Yeah, a lot of people said that. And interestingly, for the next 12 years, it's a mistake to think that war ended in 1991 and another one started in 2003. That's not what happened. That for the next 12 years, we never let up through the Clinton administration and into the next Bush administration. We never let up on the Iraqis. We were never for a day not fighting them. And we never really were able to pull away from that, because no president could say to the American people, there is this dangerous guy out there, we've already been at war with him, he's a big threat to us, but we're just going to leave him. Have I gone beyond my time?
You have, and I always feel guilty about doing this, but I want to respect our audience who came here. We try and end on time.
Sorry for the question.
But we'll certainly be around if you have questions that we haven't had time to ask. So thank you all for coming. Hope we see you here next week. And thank you, Jeremy.